The building was old, wide, and always full of sound. Music leaked from open doors and thin walls from morning until night. Some rooms carried soft notes, others sharp mistakes, and a few carried moments so beautiful that people stopped walking just to listen. Students came here with hope, fear, and big dreams. Some believed they were special. Others were still trying to prove it. Every day felt busy, loud, and important to them. At the end of each day, when most classes were done, the hallways slowly changed. Laughter faded, footsteps became fewer, and the lights felt softer. That was when the janitor's work really began. He moved quietly with his cart, cleaning floors, wiping windows, and emptying trash bins. People passed by him without a second look. To most, he was just part of the building, like the walls or the doors. He had been working there for years, long enough to know which doors creaked, which lights flickered, and which rooms stayed warm in winter. He knew the daily rhythm better than anyone. Morning rush, afternoon practice, evening calm. He never complained. He did his job well and kept to himself. No one knew much about him, and no one tried to ask. When students saw him, they nodded politely or ignored him completely. Their minds were full of notes, auditions, and competitions. They talked about future concerts, famous teachers, and big stages. They believed talent always showed itself loudly. They believed success wore clean clothes and confident smiles. One girl stood out among them. She was known for her confidence and quick laughter. She practiced hard but never lost her playful side. Teachers liked her energy, and students liked being around her. She believed life should be enjoyed, even during stress. Music came easily to her, and praise followed her often. She had never doubted her place in the world. That evening, she stayed late to rehearse. A few classmates were with her, trying different pieces, arguing over tempo, laughing at mistakes. The old piano in the hall had been ignored most of the day. It was slightly out of tune and often used only when rooms were full. Still, it carried history in its worn keys. The janitor passed by the hall as usual, pushing his cart slowly. He heard the music like he always did. Some days it was pleasant. Some days it felt rushed or careless. He never judged out loud. He simply listened while he worked. Music followed him everywhere in that building, whether he wanted it or not. He stopped for a moment near the doorway, not because the music was special, but because the laughter was loud. The group had finished playing and were joking around. Someone complained about tired fingers. Someone else said the piano was useless. The girl laughed the loudest. She made a playful challenge, not thinking much of it. Her words were light, thrown into the air like a joke meant to disappear. She teased the idea of someone playing perfectly, making it sound easy. Her tone carried confidence, not cruelty. Still, there was a sharp edge of pride in it. The others laughed along. None of them believed anything would happen. They were surrounded by talent, or so they thought. To them, skill was something you could see at first glance. The janitor heard every word. He did not react right away. He continued wiping a nearby surface, his movements steady. But inside him something stirred. Not anger, not embarrassment. Just a quiet pull he had learned to ignore over the years. He had learned long ago that silence was safer. As he worked, his eyes moved toward the piano. He did not stare. He simply noticed it like one notices an old friend from across the room. His hands paused for a second before continuing their task. No one noticed. His life outside that building was simple. He lived alone, woke early, slept late, and followed routine. The past stayed where it was, locked away behind habits and long hours of work. He did not talk about what used to be. People rarely asked, and he never offered. The students gathered their bags, still joking. The girl stretched her arms and smiled, pleased with the practice session. She felt light, careless, and sure of herself. To her, the night was just another step toward a bright future. The janitor finished cleaning the hall. He stood there for a moment longer than usual. The building felt quiet now. The laughter had faded. Only the soft hum of lights remained. He looked at the piano again. It had been years since he last touched one. Not because he forgot how, but because life had taught him not to. He took a slow breath and returned to his cart. As he walked away, the music rooms fell silent one by one. The night settled in, wrapping the building in calm. None of them knew that something small had already shifted. A line meant as a joke had landed somewhere deeper than expected. The hall looked the same. The piano stood still. The janitor continued his work. But the story had already begun. And no one there realized how close they were to a moment that would change the way they saw talent, pride, and people they never truly noticed before. The next evening, the building felt different, though no one could explain why. The students arrived as usual, carrying their instruments, bags, and notebooks. Their chatter filled the hallways with energy. Teachers moved quickly between rooms, offering advice, corrections, and encouragement. The old piano in the corner waited, silent, ignored by most. Its surface was scratched, its keys worn, yet it had a quiet presence that demanded respect from anyone who knew music well. The girl returned with her usual bright energy. She carried a small notebook filled with notes, reminders, and ideas for her next performance. She smiled at her classmates and joked as they walked toward their practice rooms. Her laughter was loud, confident, and infectious. It drew attention without effort. People noticed her, often before she even noticed them. She was used to being in the center of attention, and she liked it. The janitor was there as well. He moved along the hallways silently, just as he always did. But this night, something felt different to him too. He had thought about the girl's joke from the previous evening more than he wanted to admit. The words had lingered, teasing a memory he had buried long ago. He pushed his cart with calm movements, but inside, a quiet tension built. It was not anger. It was not excitement. It was something more complicated, something he had not felt in a long time. The students began practicing. Some played duets, some practiced scales, and others struggled with difficult pieces. The girl found a small space near the piano and began warming up. She hummed softly while moving her fingers across the keys of a smaller instrument. The hall seemed alive with music, yet the piano in the corner remained untouched. It sat like a sleeping giant, waiting for someone brave enough to wake it. One of the classmates noticed the piano and suggested jokingly, "Why don't we see if anyone can play it well? Maybe it's haunted by a ghost musician." The students laughed, thinking it was just a funny idea. The girl smiled, tilting her head. She remembered the playful challenge from the previous night. Her words had been careless, but they had carried a sharp edge of pride. "Someone play this," she said lightly, "and I will marry you." Her laugh echoed through the hall, filled with jest and confidence. The comment was meant to disappear, like smoke into the night. The janitor paused mid-step. He had been near the doorway, cleaning a nearby area, and he heard every word. For a moment he stood perfectly still, listening. The laughter around him seemed to fade. The sound of the girl's voice was clear, and it awakened something in him that had been quiet for decades. He did not move toward the piano immediately. He simply looked at it, his eyes tracing its worn edges and familiar keys. A memory flashed across his mind. A time when he had played with his heart wide open, when music was all that mattered. He shook his head slightly and continued his work, pretending not to notice. The students laughed at their own jokes, unaware of the quiet tension near the piano. The girl leaned against a wall, smiling at her friends. She was unaware that her playful challenge had found a listener who understood it in a way no one else could. The janitor's hands were steady as he continued cleaning, but inside, something had shifted. The memory of music, the memory of skill, the memory of passion, all pressed forward with a gentle insistence. The students grew bored after a while and moved to other rooms, leaving the hall quiet except for the faint hum of the lights. The girl stayed, adjusting her notebook and humming softly. She was unaware that the moment she had joked about was about to change everything. The janitor's eyes lingered on the piano. He could feel the energy in the room, a mix of excitement, challenge, and curiosity. It was almost tangible, like a thin thread waiting to be pulled. He walked slowly toward the piano. Every step was deliberate, careful, and calm. His mind was clear, though his heart beat faster than usual. The girl noticed him finally, her playful smile fading slightly. She wondered why he was there, why he seemed so focused on the instrument. She had never seen him look like this before. Most people ignored him, but now he seemed to carry an invisible weight, a seriousness that did not belong to a janitor pushing a cart. He reached the piano and paused. His hands hovered above the keys, not touching them yet. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, recalling every lesson, every performance, every note he had ever played. The students' laughter, the girls' joke, and the silent hall all melted into one quiet expectation. When he finally pressed a key, it was soft but certain. The sound filled the room in a way that was both gentle and commanding. The girl's eyes widened. She had never heard music like this from him. The notes were perfect, full of feeling, emotion, and skill that seemed impossible to come from someone who had always been invisible. The hall changed with every chord. Even the walls seemed to listen. She could feel the music in her chest, in her fingers, in her very thoughts. It was no longer a joke. The piano had awakened, and with it, a story that had been waiting for decades to be told. Her classmates returned slowly, drawn by the sound. They stopped at the doorway, unsure if they were allowed to enter. The music continued, smooth, emotional, and alive. No one spoke. Every note carried weight. Every pause was deliberate. And every melody told a story the students had never heard before. The girl could not stop staring. She had never expected this. The janitor, the quiet man who cleaned their hallways, was a master musician. The joke she had made hung in the air, but it had taken on a new meaning entirely. Time seemed to stretch. The music built, rose, and fell, carrying everyone in the hall with it. Even those who thought they understood talent realized how much they had missed. They had looked at him every day, walked past him, and never seen the depth he carried inside. Every laugh, every hurried step, every silent hour of cleaning had hidden a life full of practice, skill, and unspoken dedication. The girl's playful challenge was no longer a game. It was a bridge connecting the past with the present, a connection she had never anticipated. When the final note faded, the hall was silent again. The students were frozen, unsure whether to clap, speak, or simply breathe. The girl's mouth was slightly open, her smile gone, replaced by awe. She had believed she knew everything about talent in that building. She had believed she understood skill. But in that moment, she realized how little she truly knew. The janitor closed the piano lid gently and stood up. His hands were steady, his expression calm. He looked at the girl, and for the first time, their eyes met fully, as if he could see into her pride and curiosity at once. No words were spoken at first. The girl's laughter had vanished, replaced by quiet thought. She realized the joke she had made had awakened something far greater than she could imagine. The students who had followed her gaze were still stunned. They had seen him as a janitor, a quiet background figure. Now, they saw a man who carried the depth of life, music, and experience within him. The janitor stepped back slowly, giving space, yet his presence dominated the hall. He had proven nothing to anyone except himself. The girl's words, casual and teasing, had triggered a moment that changed the perception of everyone present. It was not about fame, not about applause, not about being noticed. It was about the truth of a life lived in music, even when no one cared to see it. The girl finally found her voice. She spoke softly, unsure if she wanted to laugh or cry. I didn't know you could play like that." Her tone carried respect, wonder, and a hint of regret. She had underestimated him, as had everyone else. The janitor nodded slightly, acknowledging her words, but he said nothing. His music had already spoken. The students returned to their practice, but their energy had changed. They played more carefully, listened more closely, and carried themselves differently. The building, too, seemed altered, filled with the echo of what had just happened. Even the worn piano now seemed honored, its history recognized. That evening ended quietly. The girl left with a new understanding, carrying a lesson she would never forget. The janitor returned to his work, finishing his routine with the same quiet dignity. But inside, a spark had been reignited, a reminder of what he once was, and still could be, even if the world did not always notice. Something small had shifted between them. A playful joke had opened the door to recognition, respect, and understanding. And though no one could have predicted it, the night had changed the way they would all see each other forever. The piano, the hall, and the quiet janitor had told a story that words alone could not carry. And the girl, who had laughed carelessly the night before, now understood the power hidden behind what is unseen, waiting quietly for its moment. The next day began like any other, but there was a quiet tension in the building that no one could explain. Students moved quickly through the hallways, carrying their instruments and books, yet their conversations had a new undertone. Some whispered about the previous night's music. Others avoided talking about it at all. The girl walked through the hall with her usual confidence, but there was a subtle change in her expression. She was thoughtful, replaying the sounds she had heard, and trying to understand what had just happened. The memory of the janitor's fingers on the piano keys, the flow of notes, and the emotion in the music stayed with her, pressing into her mind. The janitor moved along his usual path, his cart gliding over the polished floors. He had spent years perfecting his routine, and yet today each movement felt slightly different. There was a lightness in the way he worked, a quiet reminder of the music he had played the night before. Even though the students noticed little about his routine, he felt an internal satisfaction. Something inside him had awakened. He knew that the world outside the hall would not change overnight, but he could feel the shift in his own heart. Classrooms and practice rooms filled quickly. The girl took a small notebook and began jotting down ideas for her next piece. Her pencil scratched softly against the paper as she reflected on the previous evening. Every note she had played seemed minor compared to the music she had just heard. She realized how much she had underestimated the janitor, judging him by his job, his silence, and his quiet presence. She felt a subtle sting of humility, recognizing that talent can hide in the most unexpected places. The students began rehearsing for upcoming performances. Some were competitive, checking each other's progress, while others quietly improved themselves. The air buzzed with ambition, energy, and nerves. Still, the janitor continued his work, moving unnoticed between rooms, sweeping, wiping, and organizing. But there was a tension in the hallway, an invisible string connecting the piano, the girl, and the janitor. It was as if the building itself knew that something important had happened and was waiting to see what would unfold next. As evening approached, the hall emptied of students. The lights softened, creating long shadows across the worn floors. The girl lingered, finishing her notes, and eventually turned toward the piano. She was drawn by a curiosity she could not name, a pull toward the instrument that had sounded so alive. Her heart beat faster as she approached, her mind filled with questions. Could it have been a dream? Could a janitor really play like that? The janitor appeared from the other side of the hall, silently moving toward the piano as well. This time, there was no hesitation in his steps. He did not wait for a challenge or a joke. He approached the piano with calm certainty. The girl stopped, her breath catching in her chest. She felt a mixture of anticipation, fear, and admiration. He had already proven something to everyone, but now it felt as though the music might change again, revealing more than anyone had expected. He sat down carefully, his fingers hovering over the keys. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the lights. The girl watched every movement, noticing the precision and the grace with which his hands moved. His eyes were calm, but there was a depth in them that spoke of years of experience, dedication, and emotion. He pressed the first key, then another, and slowly the hall began to fill with music. The sound was different this time. It was not just skillful. It was personal, intimate, and honest. Every note carried a story, every chord a memory. The girl felt herself leaning in closer, trying to catch every subtle variation. She could hear the life of the janitor through the music, the struggles, the sacrifices, the dreams that had never been fulfilled. The music was no longer just a display of talent. It was a revelation, a glimpse into a world she had never imagined. The hall seemed to respond. Even the walls, old and worn, seemed to vibrate with the sound. Shadows moved with the rhythm, light flickered in harmony, and the air carried a weight that was both heavy and uplifting. The girl realized that she had never truly listened to music before this moment. She had studied it, practiced it, competed with it, and performed it, but she had never experienced it in this raw, powerful way. Her own hands itched to play, to respond, to join the music. But she stayed still, letting the janitor's performance fill the space. Every note he played seemed deliberate yet effortless. He had clearly spent a lifetime mastering not only the technical aspects of music but also the emotional depth it required. Each phrase told a story, each pause held meaning, and each crescendo carried the weight of his experiences. Time seemed to stretch and fold in the hall. Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. The girls' classmates, who had lingered nearby, were equally captivated. They had come to observe, to practice, or perhaps to tease. But now they were witnesses to something extraordinary. The janitor's music had transformed the space, changing not only how they heard the piano but also how they viewed the man who had been invisible to them for so long. When the final chord resonated and slowly faded, the hall remained still. The girl's breath came in shallow gasps. She had never felt music in such a complete, overwhelming way. The janitor's hands rested gently on the keys. He did not smile, he did not bow, he simply sat there, letting the silence settle around him. That silence, heavy with emotion and understanding, spoke as loudly as the music had. The girl stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know you could. I never imagined it." Her words carried awe, respect, and a hint of apology. She had laughed at a moment she now understood carried far more weight than she could have imagined. The janitor's eyes met hers, calm but aware. There was no anger, no pride in the way she feared, only quiet acknowledgement. The students slowly returned to their practice, but their energy had shifted. They moved with more awareness, listening to each other and to themselves in a way they had not before. The hall itself seemed different, imbued with the memory of the music, the presence of the janitor, and the lesson learned by those who had witnessed the performance. It was a reminder that talent often hides in unexpected places, and that a single moment can reveal more than years of observation. The girl spent the rest of the evening in reflection. She thought about her own approach to music, her pride, and her assumptions. She realized that she had judged quickly, had overlooked depth, and had laughed at something she now revered. The janitor had reminded her that every person carries a story, every experience shapes their skill, and every silence may hide remarkable talent. By the time the students had left and the hall emptied once more, the girl felt a change within herself. She was no longer just confident. She was humbled, inspired, and curious. She understood that greatness could be quiet, invisible, and patient. It did not demand attention. It simply existed, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. The janitor continued his work as usual, moving along the hallways with his cart. But there was a quiet satisfaction in his movements. He had not performed for recognition or applause. He had played because it was necessary, because the music needed to exist, and because the moment called for it. Yet he had changed the way others saw him, even if only slightly. The girl had learned a lesson she would carry forever, and the students who witnessed the music had gained insight they could never forget. The piano stood in the corner, worn but honored. It had been silent for so long, but now it held a memory that would linger in the building, in the students, and in the girl's heart. It was a reminder that music, like life, often requires patience, understanding, and a willingness to look beyond appearances. As the night fell and the hall grew quiet, the janitor pushed his cart slowly toward the exit. He paused at the doorway, looking back at the piano one last time. The girl lingered in the shadows, watching him leave. She felt a mixture of gratitude, awe, and a subtle connection she could not explain. The music had done more than fill the hall. It had opened a door to understanding, respect, and a realization that some of the most extraordinary things are often hidden in plain sight. The story of that evening would not be spoken loudly or shared widely. It did not need to be. Its power lay in the quiet impact it left on those who witnessed it. A single performance had altered perceptions, shifted attitudes, and reminded everyone present that the extraordinary can exist anywhere, waiting quietly for its moment to be revealed. And the girl, who had laughed carelessly days before, now understood the depth of talent, the importance of humility, and the truth that sometimes the most powerful stories are told without words, only through the language of music itself. The following week brought a quiet curiosity that had not existed before. The students arrived at the building, still practicing and joking, but a subtle change hovered in the air. Their conversations occasionally returned to the janitor, though carefully. Some whispered about the music he had played, trying to recall the exact notes and the emotion that had carried them through the hall. Others dared not speak, feeling that the experience was too personal, too profound to reduce to words. The girl walked through the hall with her notebook in hand, thinking constantly about what she had witnessed. The memory of those chords, the rise and fall of the melody, the gentle authority in his hands, all lingered in her mind like a vivid dream. The janitor moved through the hallways as always, pushing his cart slowly and carefully. His movements were familiar, precise, and deliberate, yet there was a subtle shift in his expression. There was pride, yes, but it was quiet and reflective. He did not seek attention, but he was aware now that people had begun to notice, in small ways, that he carried a talent that had long remained hidden. For him, the music was not about recognition or applause. It was about the life he had lived, the memories he had carried, and the stories he could tell without speaking. Yet he could sense a change, small and invisible, in the way the world moved around him. The girl spent the afternoon revisiting her notes, rewriting passages in her notebook and testing melodies she had practiced before. But nothing she played compared to the depth and feeling she had heard from the janitor. Every time she tried to replicate it, the music felt empty, mechanical, and flat. It was then she realized that skill alone was not enough. There was something more, something lived, something earned over years of both triumph and hardship. The janitor had not just practiced. He had lived through the music, and every note had carried a part of his story. A few of the students cautiously approached the piano during breaks, glancing at the janitor as he worked nearby. They wanted to ask him questions, to hear him play again, but they felt unsure. How could someone who had been overlooked for years suddenly hold such power over their perception? The janitor continued quietly, sometimes noticing their hesitation, but he said nothing. He had learned that patience, observation, and silence often spoke louder than words ever could. The girl finally gathered the courage to speak. She waited until the hall was mostly empty, her notebook clutched in her hand. "I want to understand," she said softly, as if speaking aloud could help her focus. "I want to know how you learned to play like that." The janitor paused, his cleaning halted mid-step. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see a mixture of surprise, caution, and quiet amusement in his eyes. He did not answer immediately. He only nodded slightly, indicating that she could sit, that she could watch, that she could learn in her own way. She sat on a small bench nearby, her notebook on her lap, ready to listen. He approached the piano slowly, gently resting his hands on the keys. He played a simple passage first, testing her attention and patience. Then, he began a slow story in music, one note leading to another, each phrase carrying emotion and history. The girl felt the music like a living presence, wrapping around her, moving through her chest and stomach, making her heart beat in rhythm with every chord. She realized that what she had laughed at, what she had seen as a joke, was a bridge to understanding something larger, something real and human. He did not speak while playing. The lesson was not about instructions, scales, or techniques. It was about presence, feeling, and listening. Each note taught her patience. Each pause taught her reflection. Each crescendo taught her that emotion cannot be forced but must rise naturally, from experience, from life itself. She tried to mimic him, but her notes felt forced, hollow, and out of place. She understood now that talent is not just about practice. It is about connection, connection to oneself, to the instrument, and to the world. After the music ended, she stayed silent for a long moment, letting it settle. Her hands hovered above the keys, hesitant, unsure, but filled with new respect. "I've never heard anyone play like that," she whispered. She had always thought she knew what talent was, but her assumptions had been shattered. The janitor nodded slightly, but he did not smile. There was no need. The lesson had been delivered, quietly, completely, and without fanfare. In the following days, she returned to the piano often, observing the janitor as he worked. She took notes in her notebook, not about the technicalities, but about the way he approached the instrument, the care in his hands, the patience in his movements. She began to understand that music was not just sound. It was life, memory, and emotion shaped into something audible. And she began to see the janitor differently, not as a background figure, but as someone with depth, history, and mastery hidden under years of silence. Others began to notice as well. A few students who had initially laughed or dismissed the previous night's events started approaching him more cautiously, curious about his story. They did not ask directly. They observed, they listened, and they waited. The janitor accepted this attention quietly, never seeking it, but he allowed it. Slowly, the building's culture began to shift. The invisible walls around him began to feel thinner, and the silence that had once protected him now carried the quiet power of recognition. The girl's perception of him had changed completely. She had laughed at a moment she thought was playful and inconsequential, but it had turned into a profound lesson. She had realized that judging others without understanding their past, their struggles, or their skill is a mistake that everyone makes at some point. The janitor had lived through challenges, lost opportunities, and years of quiet dedication, all of which were reflected in his music. Every note carried weight and experience, and she felt honored to witness it. The janitor's music became a silent thread connecting students, teachers, and even himself. It was no longer just a skill. It was a story, a living lesson that shaped the way everyone approached the building and its music. Students who had been competitive and judgmental began to see one another differently. They listened more carefully, practiced more mindfully, and developed a deeper respect for the people around them. The girl, especially, learned to balance her confidence with humility, her energy with observation, and her laughter with understanding. One afternoon, as the sun filtered through the tall windows, the girl approached the janitor again. She had been working on a new piece, one inspired by the music she had heard. She placed her fingers lightly on the keys and began to play. It was careful, thoughtful, and tentative, but there was something honest in her attempt. The janitor watched, his eyes calm and steady, allowing her to explore without interruption. He had learned long ago that teaching is not about correction alone. It is about presence, patience, and letting the student find their own way. As the days passed, the connection between them grew. She began to understand not just the music, but the person behind it. She realized that every person carries unseen experiences, hidden talent, and stories waiting to be shared. She felt a quiet admiration for the janitor, a respect that had grown from observation, reflection, and genuine understanding. It was no longer about a joke, a playful challenge, or a momentary surprise. It was about life, experience, and the way skill can be shaped by time, dedication, and unseen effort. The janitor, for his part, felt a gentle satisfaction. He had not played to impress, to gain recognition, or to show superiority. He had played because it was part of who he was, because the music needed to exist, and because the moment had called for it. Yet he saw the impact it had on those around him. The girl's respect, the students' curiosity, and even the subtle changes in the building's atmosphere were proof that quiet, persistent dedication has power. It can change perceptions, teach lessons, and open doors that were once invisible. By the end of the week, the building had transformed in subtle ways. The piano, once overlooked and ignored, had become a symbol of hidden talent and unspoken stories. The girl, now more thoughtful, more observant, and more respectful, carried her experiences forward. She had learned a lesson that could not be taught in a classroom, a lesson about patience, humility, and the depth of human experience. The janitor, too, had found a quiet acknowledgement, a sense of connection, and the satisfaction of knowing that even the simplest, most silent life can carry profound impact. And so, the building returned to its daily rhythm, alive with music, laughter, and practice. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The janitor was no longer invisible. The students had learned to see beyond the obvious. And the girl, who had once laughed carelessly at a playful challenge, now understood the true power of observation, respect, and human connection. The music had spoken, silently and profoundly, changing lives in ways that no words could ever fully capture. The final week of that story began quietly, with the building filled with its usual sounds. Footsteps, laughter, and music spilling from open doors. But something invisible had changed. The students moved differently, carrying a sense of attentiveness that had not been there before. Conversations were quieter, softer, and laced with curiosity rather than judgment. The girl walked through the hallways, notebook in hand, reflecting on the days that had passed. She had been changed by what she had witnessed. The music had opened her eyes to something deeper, something beyond skill, beyond confidence, and beyond playful jokes. The janitor moved through the hallways as he always did, but there was a subtle difference in his posture and expression. He no longer felt entirely invisible, though he did not seek recognition. There was quiet satisfaction in his movements, a reminder that his talent and dedication had been seen, understood, and respected. He pushed his cart with deliberate care, cleaning and tidying, but every step carried a sense of quiet accomplishment. He had learned that sometimes the most meaningful impact comes not from loud achievements, but from subtle, consistent presence. The girl returned to the piano often, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by a small group of classmates who had begun to respect the instrument and the person behind it. She approached it carefully, setting her notebook down and letting her fingers hover above the keys. Every time she played, she thought of the janitor, his music, and the lessons it had brought into her life. She had realized that music was not just about notes and practice. It was about feeling, about life experience, and about connection. Each time she pressed a key, she tried to capture some of the depth she had witnessed, though she knew it would take years to approach it. One afternoon, the janitor paused his routine and watched her play from a distance. He did not interfere, did not correct, and did not interrupt. He simply observed, allowing her to explore, to experiment, and to make her own mistakes. He had learned long ago that teaching is not about control but about guidance and presence. She felt his gaze but did not turn. She understood without words that he supported her journey, not as a mentor in the traditional sense, but as someone who had shown her the power of listening, patience, and respect. Over time, the building itself seemed to reflect the change. The old piano, once ignored and underestimated, had become a symbol of quiet mastery and the hidden stories that dwell within people. Students moved with more awareness, playing with more care and listening more closely to one another. The culture had shifted, subtly, from competition and noise to understanding and collaboration. The janitor's presence, though quiet, had taught a lesson that could not be measured in grades or applause. It was a lesson of human connection, of respect for unseen effort, and of the patience required to truly see someone's worth. The girl spent hours reflecting on the impact of that single playful joke she had made weeks ago. "I will marry you," she had laughed, unaware of how deeply those words would resonate. She realized that the moment had not been about marriage, humor, or bravado. It had been about challenging perception, questioning assumptions, and opening a door that had long been closed. The janitor had accepted the challenge without hesitation, responding with music that carried more than sound. It carried history, emotion, and truth. The girl understood now that even a casual comment can ripple in unexpected ways, changing lives quietly and profoundly. As the days passed, she noticed more students approaching the piano with a mix of caution and excitement. Some asked the janitor to play again, though carefully and respectfully. Others simply watched, learning silently through observation. The janitor accepted this attention with grace, his movements calm, his expressions steady. He did not seek praise or recognition. The power of his music came not from the applause it earned but from the understanding it inspired. The students, especially the girl, began to grasp that greatness is often hidden, quiet, and patient, and that noticing it requires attentiveness, humility, and empathy. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the hall lights softened, the girl stayed late once more. She set her notebook down and ran her fingers lightly across the keys, hesitating. Before playing, the janitor approached quietly, not to interrupt, but to offer presence and encouragement. He rested his hands briefly on the piano, guiding the flow of air and space, but did not play. She understood, silently, that he was there as a witness to her growth, not to overshadow it. The moment was hers, and as her fingers moved, she felt the music bloom, carrying a depth and honesty she had never achieved alone. The janitor's life, once hidden behind quiet routines and unnoticed days, had become a lesson for those around him. He had not changed his job, nor had he sought fame or attention. Yet he had altered the building, its students, and the girl's perspective in ways that could not be undone. They had learned that every person carries stories, experience, and unseen talents. The janitor had lived through decades of practice, hardship, and quiet dedication. He had sacrificed recognition and opportunity for survival and routine, yet he had never lost the essence of who he was. And in a single performance, he had shared that essence with those willing to see it. The girl reflected on her own journey as she left the hall that evening. She had laughed, she had underestimated, and she had learned. She understood that life is full of hidden stories, that every person she meets carries unseen weight, and that sometimes the most extraordinary moments come from the most ordinary people. She felt gratitude for the lessons, humility for her prior assumptions, and a desire to continue learning not just music but understanding, patience, and empathy. The janitor, finishing his routine, paused at the doorway, looking back at the hall one last time. The piano stood there, silent now, but imbued with memory, respect, and the presence of those who had witnessed its voice. He smiled faintly to himself, not out of pride, but out of quiet acknowledgement. He had shown the students, and the girl in particular, the power of dedication, patience, and the depth hidden within ordinary lives. He had shared his story without words, letting music speak where language could not. In the following weeks, the atmosphere in the building subtly shifted. Students approached each other with more respect, observed one another's efforts with attentiveness, and understood that talent is not always visible. The girl continued to visit the piano, sometimes with classmates, sometimes alone, carrying the lessons of that transformative week into her own practice and life. She had learned that laughter can challenge perception, that silence can teach more than words, and that observing deeply can reveal hidden truths. The story of the janitor and the girl, the playful challenge and the music that followed, became a quiet legend within the building. It was not a story told loudly or for recognition. It was a lesson woven into daily life, in the way students approached practice, in the way they observed each other, and in the respect they held for the quiet work done behind the scenes. The janitor continued his work, unchanged in routine but transformed in impact. And the girl carried forward an understanding that would guide her, inspire her, and shape her choices for years to come. The piano remained in its corner, worn but honored. It had seen countless students, many confident, some brilliant, and some unsure. Yet none had played like the janitor had. Its music, though silent now, carried the echo of that night and the lessons it had taught. It reminded all who approached it that mastery is not always loud, that humility and patience have value, and that extraordinary experiences can come from the most unexpected places. And so, life in the building continued. The students practiced, laughed, and moved through their routines. Teachers guided, corrected, and encouraged. The janitor cleaned, pushed his cart, and moved through the halls quietly. Yet beneath the surface, the impact of a single playful joke, a quiet performance, and the recognition of hidden talent had left a lasting mark. The girl had learned to see beyond appearances, to understand depth, and to appreciate the quiet power of dedication and life experience. And in the corners of the building, where shadows mingled with sunlight and the soft hum of music lingered, the story remained, silent, profound, and unforgettable.